Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Trump's announcement today that, quote, he just had an excellent conversation with the highly respected President Joseph Aoun of Lebanon and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel. These two leaders have agreed that in order to achieve peace in caps between their countries, they will formally begin a 10-day ceasefire in caps at 5 p.m. Eastern. It has been my honor to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th. So let's get it done in caps. Joining us for a reality check is Habib Battah, a Beirut-based independent investigative journalist, filmmaker, and founder of BeirutReport.com, a contributor to The Guardian, BBC World, Al Jazeera, Lebanon's Daily Star newspaper, and others. He has covered Lebanon and the Middle East for over 20 years and previously taught journalism and media studies at the American University of Beirut and is now a professor of digital media at St. Lawrence University in New York. Then we'll examine how big oil is making $30 million an hour in extra profits from the war on Iran and speak with Basav, the Climate Justice Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies. Previously, he worked for about 11 years as a strategic corporate campaign researcher at the United Food and Commercial Workers, and also had experience as a campaigner on the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. We will discuss his article at Common Dreams, We Must Fight Fossil Fuel Oligarchs to Save Democracy. And then we'll speak with Lindsay Koshgarian, the Program Director of the National Priorities Project, where she oversees nationalpriorities.org. Her work on the federal budget includes analysis of the federal budget process and politics, military spending, and specifically how federal budget choices for different spending priorities and taxation interact. And she has an article at Common Dreams. We will discuss the average taxpayer shelled out $4,000 for war and weapons last year. Then finally, we'll speak with Amy Goodman, the award-winning investigative journalist, author, and host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, which airs on more than 1,500 public television and radio stations worldwide. She's the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, including Democracy Now!, 20 years covering the movements changing America, and The Silent Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. And she's the subject of a new documentary from Carl Deal and Tia Lesson, Steal This Story, Please, which debuts tomorrow exclusively at the Laemmle Royal Cinema in West Los Angeles, with a national rollout to follow. And before we begin, with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power, as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Habib Battah, who is a Beirut-based independent investigative journalist, filmmaker, and founder of BeirutReport.com. He's a contributor to The Guardian, BBC World, Al Jazeera, Lebanon's Daily Star newspapers, and many others. And he's covered Lebanon and the Middle East for over 20 years and previously taught journalism and media studies at the American University of Beirut and is now a professor of digital media at St. Lawrence University in New York. Welcome to Background Briefing, Habib Battah.
Thank you.
So it seems that Trump has been pushing Israel and Lebanon to come to some kind of truce, because I think it's a precondition which the Iranians have insisted on. They're not going to take the ceasefire seriously as long as Israel is pounding Lebanon. And it looks as if today there's some progress made. Now, Trump has announced a 10-day ceasefire. And on Truth Social, he wrote the following: I just had excellent conversations with the highly respected President Joseph Aoun of Lebanon and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel. These two leaders have agreed that in order to achieve peace in caps between their countries, they will formally begin a 10-day ceasefire in caps at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard today. On Tuesday, the two countries met for the first time in 34 years here in Washington, D.C., with our great Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. I have directed Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Rubio, together with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Raisin Kane, to work with Israel and Lebanon to achieve a lasting peace in caps. It has been my honor to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th. So let's get it done in caps. So obviously it's the usual self-serving stuff, but do you think there's any substance here?
Well, I don't think anything has been solved. The places that he claims to have solved are actually lying in complete ruin, and entire, cities have been decimated and flattened. So people tend to think about wars as happening when bullets are blazing, but the wars have very long afterlives, and we have, in Lebanon, lived with that for many years and seen people living in refugee camps for generations, and that only leads to more tension, and the conflict is continuing in Lebanon. And elsewhere, and obviously the Strait of Hormuz continues to be blockaded. There's been huge pressure on world markets, so I don't think anything has been resolved by President Donald Trump. If anything, he's sowing the seeds for a lot of future conflict, and destruction of civilian life, and really kind of erasure of entire cities and countries. So, there is this latest piece of news, and there was this high-level meeting, which, is very interesting because it kind of contradicts Lebanese law. Lebanese law forbids, contact between Lebanese and Israelis. There's a state of war in the country. This talk came on the backs of 10,000 buildings being destroyed in Lebanon by Israel over the past year or so of conflict, since 24 actually. And also it comes in the back of, the entire south of the country being occupied by Israeli forces. The Lebanese delegation is mocked by a lot of people in Lebanon as negotiating what, having really nothing to bargain with. Usually a negotiation involves some kind of compromise between two sides. Israel has been bombarding Lebanon, and just today we've seen an image of an ambulance in Lebanon with a live video of paramedics treating a patient in an ambulance while Israel strikes the ambulance. Israel has targeted, according to the World Health Organization, something like 133 medical facilities in the country. They've just blown up a school in South Lebanon. So, I mean, for a lot of Lebanese in South Lebanon and across the country, watching these negotiations is almost farcical. How do you negotiate with a force that is, ethnically cleansing, right? Israel has released satellite imagery of Lebanese villages that have completely been erased from the map. They've detonated, buildings, or they've shelled them, completely flattening them or bombed them. So it is kind of rich, right, to kind of claim that this government that is unable to protect any of its citizens, any of its territories, and Israel has, by the way, cut off, right, South Lebanon from the rest of the country. They've bombed all the major bridges. So many people are suffering and not able to get any kind of medical help, food. Imagine, a whole part of a country being cut off from the rest of. The people of South Lebanon feel abandoned by this government. Over 1 million people, right, have been made homeless and are seeking refuge in other parts of the country. So basically clearing out the entire population, which is, a clear act of ethnic cleansing according to any definition, and then destroying all of their houses and leveling their villages, and then coming around and saying that you're going to do a ceasefire. Now, one more thing about ceasefires, there's a kind of running joke that Israeli ceasefires means that, everyone ceases and Israel fires. We've seen in Lebanon over the past 2 years or so, Israel bombing Lebanon every single day, despite the ceasefire. So the United Nations forces in Lebanon, the UNIFIL, have recorded over 10,000 violations of Israel's ceasefire. So we had a ceasefire before this ceasefire. And then there's been a ceasefire in Gaza, and the killing has continued. So I think there's very little faith in Israel promising a ceasefire.
Well, what about the possibility of Hezbollah suddenly giving up its power and influence? That seems equally unlikely.
It's a completely, I mean, to believe that you would have to have read nothing about Lebanon, read nothing about the history of the country, understood nothing about Hezbollah, because again, Hezbollah wasn't created in a vacuum. Hezbollah grew out of uh, Israel's previous occupation of Lebanon. Israel has tried to occupy Lebanon, has tried to claim that it is, going to sign peace with Lebanon many times over the decades past. All of those situations have, been really very fleeting, unmemorable moments, these kind of meetings. I'm sure that this meeting, might be just a footnote in history, because we have seen so many of these occasions where, Israel occupied Lebanon for 18 years back in the 80s and the 90s. And during that time, they managed to create a militia, a South Lebanon army, which was headed by Lebanese Christians that were allied with Israel, militias that didn't represent the whole country, using these proxy forces and really creating a lot of division in the country, over this, right? Pitting people against each other. And Hezbollah grew out of that situation in which it was a daily misery for people living in South Lebanon for decades. The Israelis ran, this militia. They ran torture facilities, an infamous facility called Khiam Prison, which so many war crimes and tortures were documented there. They were rounding up people in the south. It was really a terrorizing reign that Israel held for almost 2 decades in South Lebanon, and that's where Hezbollah came from, right? Hezbollah grew out of people, resisting that. And then again, Iran coming in and offering support to those people, seeing that they were aligned with their values of stopping expansionist Israel. And that, that's why Hezbollah exists. And Hezbollah has grown from that, and gotten a lot of credence from its ability to repel the Israelis. It took them a war of attrition, over all these years. Israel finally withdrew in the year 2000 due to receiving so many attacks from Hezbollah fighters. And the whole country, really grew to support them after that, because people could come back to their villages for the first time in 2000 and their homes that had been held by Israel. But then Hezbollah has grew massively since then to a movement. It's not really a bunch of, people think of Hezbollah as a bunch of armed men, in the jungles or in the olive groves of Lebanon and the tunnels. But really, Hezbollah encompasses a political and social movement that is one of the greatest ever seen in Lebanese history, and probably history of the Middle East, where over 1 million people have become followers of Hezbollah, and they do a lot of things. They do hospitals and schools, all kinds of institutions in society. They create, they even have an orchestra. They have, it's such a big social and political movement in the country that has so much, loyalty. So it's impossible for the Israelis to kill that idea of people's resistance, right, to occupation of their land and reclaiming their territory. And again, this happened all because the Lebanese government has always been such a weak government that they've never been able to protect South Lebanon or provide any of these educational services. In fact, the Lebanese military has withdrawn from South Lebanon, allowing the Israelis to. So in what world does a military claim sovereignty or government claim to be effective if it's withdrawing its forces from its territories, right, and allowing its citizens to be occupied and cut off from the rest of the country? So, the Lebanese government is a very weak government. The Lebanese government cannot even provide electricity in the country. The Lebanese government cannot even, monitor a street intersection. If you drive a car in Lebanon, the police cannot even stop you from all the traffic lights are ignored constantly, and that's been like that since I was a child. It's a completely chaotic disaster of a governance in Lebanon. So this government really has no ability to negotiate in any way, has no bargaining chips. The only reason why Israel is interested in negotiating with Lebanon is because of Hezbollah's constant attacks. And even though Israel has tried to occupy a lot of those territories in South Lebanon, they have been repelled constantly by Hezbollah attacks, and they have not been able to reach the Litani River, nowhere near it. So I predict that this kind of battle intensity will continue as long as land is occupied by Israel. There will be a resistance to that land, and again, Hezbollah grew out in the 80s from very small beginnings. Light arms, small operations, guerrilla warfare. Hezbollah today is in a much bigger position, even despite all these Israeli attacks on their facilities. They're in a much better position to continue this guerrilla war until their land is liberated.
So let's talk about what seems to be linked to this meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister and the President of Lebanon, even if it's kind of not entirely serious. It seems to be happening because of U.S. pressure, and I'm assuming that the US is pressuring Israel and Lebanon because the Iranians are saying, we can't take any peace deal with the US seriously as long as Israel is free to attack Hezbollah. Isn't that the broader dynamic here?
Well, I mean, I think we live in a world where might makes right, unfortunately, and it seems that the only thing that the Americans and the Israelis listen to is force. And we've seen that happening in Iran, right? With Iran, very shocking, right, to American officials that they thought this was going to be very easy. Iran put up a very powerful fight. Even Trump admitted to that they're very strong fighters. And the U.S. was not able to get its way there. And it's the same thing, in South Lebanon, where the Israelis thought they could just come in and they could knock out the leadership of Hezbollah. Remember, they killed the leader of Hezbollah. It was a huge blow to the organization. They have had a lot of attacks on the organization and its facilities, but they keep going, just like the Iranians. So yeah, I think that pressure of the violence has and the pressure on financial markets, the pressure on Israelis living in North Israel who can't go to their homes because of the attacks by Hezbollah in retaliation for Israel's destruction of the country. So it does seem that force in this case, through Iran, through Hezbollah, has really played a strong role in backing the U.S. off somewhat. However, I wouldn't say that this is kind of going. We don't really know if this is going to last, as I've been outlining. Israeli negotiators themselves, a really interesting piece in The Guardian recently by Israeli negotiator Levy, Daniel Levy, who basically, laid out this Greater Israel project that his government is pursuing. And we've seen Israeli ministers, claim that they want to reach Damascus. They've already held on to hundreds of kilometers, 400 plus kilometers of land in Syria. And they are, still occupying these parts of Lebanon, despite, being embattled in conflicts with Hezbollah. So, there is a very expansionist Israel on our horizon. And even Israelis are warning about that. So I don't know, if anything is going to last, but it seems like, yes, there has been a lot of pressure and a lot of pushback on the U.S. and Israel through those that have been really standing up against all odds, right? I mean, who would have thought that, the most powerful and violent and technologically advanced militaries in the world, Israel and the United States, right, cannot just get their way with Iran or with Lebanon. The way that they have thought that they could just change regimes and change governments, it's been very shocking to them because they really haven't read their history and they haven't really taken people seriously, and they've really overestimated their positions.
Well, it's pretty clear that Netanyahu kind of beguiled Trump into this war, and the Secretary of State even suggested that was the case. So, given that Trump has set a trap for himself and is obviously desperate to get out of this, and the Republicans have got to be screaming about the price of gas, which is going to continue to go up, and the rest of the world, of course, not that Trump cares about anybody but himself, but the Europeans, the Asians are all suffering, and so is the rest of the world from rising prices. And it's not just that the cost of oil and gas goes up. There's a certain point, it's already happened in the Philippines, where you literally run out of it. And we're heading into that kind of territory now. So it seems to me that Trump is desperate. And what's your sense of whether or not this could hold, even if it's somewhat cosmetic, as you've made it pretty clear in terms of what's going on in Lebanon? Could it hold for long enough for him to get out of this? I mean, my suspicion is that he just wants to declare victory and get out of it, and is looking for some kind of fig leaf.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, it does seem this is very, all these theatrics are kind of could be face-saving measures. Perhaps the Israelis are also running out of. I mean, we know that, these very expensive munitions are finite. They're not endless. There've been many reports about interceptors, being exhausted. And we're seeing more and more actually rockets, but from Hezbollah and Iran getting through. That's another big aspect of this that no one expected. I mean, Iran has pretty much obliterated a large portion of America's infrastructure, military infrastructure across the Middle East. Um, And Hezbollah too has been penetrating the Iron Dome and hitting a lot of Israeli military outposts. So they could be also taking on a lot of damages, the U.S. and Israel, and trying to come to some kind of an end to this. But the ceasefire, in Lebanon, I would say no matter what happens in Iran, that the battle in Lebanon is likely to continue because it has done that for a long time. The Iranians have faced the Israeli fury and violence for the past, few weeks and months. However, Lebanese have faced Israel's violence for almost the entire existence of Israel since the 1950s, early 50s. Israel had occupied and invaded Lebanese territory, and they've done it so many times. So Israel is very keen on expanding itself. Again, just listening to their own government members speak. So it seems that this expansion will continue to be pushed. But despite whatever happens with Trump and the U.S. government, that's just a moment in history, right? But Israel has been pursuing these kind of policies for 70 plus years. Taking big parts of their neighbors, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and there's no reason to expect that to be ending anytime soon, unfortunately. But it seems that people will continue to fight that, and have always fought that in the past, especially in Lebanon.
Well, Habib Battah, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Habib Battah, who's a Beirut-based independent investigative journalist, filmmaker, and founder of BeirutReport.com, a contributor to The Guardian, BBC World, Al Jazeera, Lebanon's Daily Star newspaper, and others. He's covered Lebanon and the Middle East for over 20 years and previously taught journalism and media studies at the American University of Beirut, and now is a professor of digital media at St. Lawrence University in New York. We're going to take a brief station break, back looking into how the average taxpayer shelled out over $4,000 for war and weapons last year.
That until that day, the dream of lasting peace, world citizenship, rule of international morality, will remaining but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. Now everywhere is war.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Basav, who's the Climate Justice Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies. Previously, he worked for about 11 years as a strategic corporate campaign researcher at the United Food and Commercial Workers, and he also has experience as a campaigner on the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and he has an article at Common Dreams, We Must Fight Fossil Fuel Oligarchs to Save Democracy. Welcome to Background Briefing, Basav Sen.
Yes, and thank you for having me on your show, Ian.
Well, it's good to talk to you again, Basav, and the only winners in this dreadful and unnecessary and misbegotten war against Iran, and that's tying up the Gulf and causing tremendous energy shocks in both Asia and in Europe, and of course in the rest of the world even more so. The only winners seem to be the American oil companies, or what used to be called the Seven Sisters, and the military-industrial complex. And it's worth noting, surely, or it seems pretty obvious to me, that these are the biggest backers of Trump, or among the biggest backers of Trump, particularly the Silicon Valley oligarchs who are now getting into the military-industrial complex, or what they call the digital industrial complex, the new weapons bonanzas with Anduril and Palantir, etc. They're all making out like bandits, and so are the oil companies. So do you think the American people who are against this war at some point or other can link the two and realize that being against this war is also being against big oil?
I believe that consciousness is actually growing, where people are recognizing, first of all, that what we are living under is an oligarchic system. And by the way, Trump did not invent this overnight. The United States has been trending in this direction for a while, with powerful billionaires injecting money into our political system and getting their desired candidates into office and getting their desired policy outcomes being enacted. But under Trump, it has come out into the open in a way that is really striking to watch, where the US government does not even pretend to care about, let alone international law or international norms. They don't even pretend to care about the broader public interest of the American people. And this attack on Iran and also Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East is a really striking illustration of that. There is no justification for this. This was a completely unprovoked attack, and it serves no legitimate U.S. security need, and it enriches exactly the business sectors you mentioned, the ones who we traditionally call war profiteers, which is the big weapons manufacturers and their sort of new technology equivalents, the ones you mentioned, like Palantir, who provide a lot of the software for cutting edge weaponry and surveillance systems, but also big oil, which is becoming increasingly clear are also war profiteers. They are set up to profit from scarcity. They are set up to profit from volatility and economic shocks. And, in the meantime, most working people in this country are really facing a cost of living crunch. So these things, oligarchy, the government acting in support of the economic interests of a narrow elite, and essentially not caring about people's day-to-day struggles, and their very close, you could say, crony capitalist connections with particular sectors of business. These are all, in people's faces today. And it's also incumbent upon, those of us who study these issues, those of us who are engaged in organizing and activism around it, to use this as a teachable moment for more public education about the inextricable links between the fossil fuel industry and war and empire and fascism and authoritarianism at home.
So when you go to fill up your car, assuming you don't have an electric, or even if you have a hybrid, you still have to put gas in it. I think you should recognize that the high price of gas, and it's particularly high out here in California, $6, sometimes $7 a gallon, that you are paying to enrich particularly the American oil companies, because their cost to produce oil in this country before this war, their expenses haven't gone up one dime, but their profits have gone up enormously because of the global price of oil. So they're making out like crazy, while we have to pay the high price, which is the price from the global price, right? So the American consumer is just making U.S. oil companies richer than, ExxonMobil is now $111 billion richer. Shell is $34 billion richer, etc. I could go down the list.
Yes, and oil companies take advantage of the fact that their product does not undergo a significant drop in demand, even when the price goes up. The way economists describe that, it's because there's a low elasticity of demand for oil. In other words, the demand for oil is not very sensitive to price increases. And that's because, people who are dependent on driving to get to work still have to get to work, even when the price for gas goes through the roof. I mean, they can save on completely discretionary trips, like they can put off that road trip vacation, but they still need to go to work. They still need to go to their doctor's appointments. They still need to go to the grocery store. So the demand for oil is not very impacted by the price. And these companies, they really take advantage of that to price gouge people and make those astronomical criminal profits that you were talking about.
And of course, the three Russian oil companies, Gazprom, Rosneft, and Lukoil, they are making an estimated $23.9 billion from Iran-related war profits. So it's not just the U.S. oil companies, it's also Putin is making out like a bandit. And so, by the way, is Mike Wirth, right, the CEO of Chevron?
Right.
Tell me what's going on with him.
He personally made, and this isn't, this is beyond the company. Mike Wirth personally made more than $100 million from this Iran war. So it's obscene. It's like a person who is making money from human misery, a person who is making money from the deaths of more than 150 school children, a person who's making money from the city of Tehran being blanketed in poisonous gas, resulting from the U.S. Bombing an oil refinery. So literally, these people are war profiteers. They profit from human misery.
So tell us about your ideas in terms of how we must fight fossil fuel oligarchs to save democracy.
So the fossil fuel industry has a compelling political interest in an anti-democratic authoritarian government for two reasons. First of all, they are a very wealthy, powerful, politically connected industry that is also in crisis. And they're in crisis for a couple of different reasons. One is that growing numbers of people worldwide are legitimately angry at them because of their role in driving both systemic climate change impacts like wildfires and hurricanes and droughts, and also extremely specific, local, but devastating ecological impacts like polluting watersheds and aquifers and polluting the air near their facilities and displacing people from their land with their drilling and fracking operations, etc. And so there's a growing backlash against the industry. And at the same time, they're facing economic competition from cheaper and cheaper renewable energy. And this recent price spike because of the war in Iran has accelerated the trend towards transitioning to renewable energy in many parts of the world. So they are under these twin threats and they are politically connected. So it's in a way obvious that they would resort to using their political connections to try to stamp out the opposition. And, this takes the form of their pairing up with authoritarian governments to crush dissent. And that has happened in very naked ways in places like, for example, Indonesia, where Exxon has collaborated with the Indonesian military to target their opponents in the Banda Aceh region in Sumatra, where they have very polluting and destructive operations. And it also manifests in countries like the United States, where the oil and gas industry has lobbied state legislatures across the country. And now in 19 US states, it is a crime to protest against fossil fuel infrastructure within certain constraints. They call these so-called critical infrastructure laws, and they criminalize protest at or near some kinds of infrastructure, such as pipelines and drilling and fracking operations and oil and gas storage terminals, refineries, etc. And they also often include these overbroad conspiracy provisions. So anyone in any way participating in organizing such a protest could be facing criminal charges. And this is an example of the industry using their access to the political system to turn it more authoritarian by trying to criminalize dissent.
But just in the last few minutes, the bottom line, it seems to me, Basav, is that the big oil companies are making $30 million an hour. Billions are just pouring into their coffers. And the oil that they're selling the American consumer costs them not one dime more than it did before this war started. But they're reaping this massive windfall because of the global price of oil. And before the last elections, Trump went to big oil and asked them for $1 billion. And I don't know how much he got of the $1 billion, but they certainly supported his campaign and helped elect him, along with Elon Musk, who helped elect the Republicans as well, with something like $300 million. So it would seem to me that whatever big oil donated to Trump to elect him, my God, talk about a return on investment. This war has just, Trump's war has made them billions and billions of dollars richer. So whatever they gave to Trump is chump change compared to how much money they're making out of this war.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. This is the epitome of crony capitalist corruption, which I would also argue is actually a core feature of fascism. Because if you go back to historical fascism, you see that there was this tight crony capitalist relationship between big German and Italian industry and their respective governments.
Well, I thank you for joining us. I really appreciate some clarity here. And as I say, every time we go to the pump out here in California, we feel the pain, and our anger and annoyance and fury should be directed at the likes of Mike Wirth, who've just made an extra $104 million out of, as you point out, Basav, out of the misery and death of schoolgirls in Iran.
Yes, and thank you for having me on your show, as always, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Basav Sen, who is the Climate Justice Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies. He previously worked for about 11 years as a strategic corporate campaign researcher at United Food and Commercial Workers, and also had experience as a campaigner on the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. And he has an article at Common Dreams, "We Must Fight Fossil Fuel Oligarchs to Save Democracy." And joining us now is Lindsay Koshgarian, who's the Program Director of the National Priorities Project, where she oversees nationalpriorities.org. Her work on the federal budget includes analysis of the federal budget process and politics, military spending, and specifically how federal budget choices for different spending priorities and taxation interact. And she has an article at Common Dreams. The average taxpayer shelled out over $4,000 for war and weapons last year. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lindsay Koshgarian.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And your work is about last year, and this year is going to be so much worse. But let's deal with last year. You learned from your research that the average taxpayer paid $4,049 for weapons of war last year, which, of course, is a huge sum compared to cost of living costs going up, etc., and stagnant wages. And in terms of the other programs funded by income tax dollars, Medicaid is the next highest item on our income tax receipt, and that ran at a little under $2,500 per household or per taxpayer, and that funds health care for 1 in 5 Americans. And of course, the Republicans raided Medicaid in order to pay for tax cuts for the billionaires. And then school lunches and other nutrition programs, by comparison, ran at $124 per taxpayer, and the Postal Service $19 per taxpayer. So there you have our priorities. So, Lindsay, if you look at or listen to the Secretary of Defense, or he calls himself Secretary of War, Hegseth, you would think that, well, this is a bloodthirsty country that's all about killing people and no quarter, no mercy. So, in terms of priorities, have we become a nation of death, not life?
Well, that's a way of putting it. It's been true for quite some time that we overinvest in war and weapons, and the problem is it's just getting worse. So, yes, under this administration, for the first time since World War II, our war budget has gone over $1 trillion, $1 trillion. And what's worse is that Secretary Hegseth and President Trump have now requested $1.5 trillion, more than a 40% increase for their war budget for next year. And so you can imagine this will just enable more of the same, the war on Iran or the invasion of Venezuela and the kidnapping of the Venezuelan president. All of these things are possible because of this $1 trillion budget. And if we give them more money, they will make even more of this possible. And this administration doesn't seem to believe in the laws of war or following the laws of war. It doesn't seem to believe in protecting civilians. It doesn't seem to believe in honoring negotiations or agreements with other countries. And so this is an extremely dangerous time. And of course, as you alluded to just a minute ago, it's also happening at a time when people in this country are struggling to just survive, to get by. About half of the people in this country right now have said that they are struggling to afford basic necessities like food and healthcare and transportation, and that's only getting worse now. Just take the case of the war on Iran. People are effectively paying for that in 3 different ways. We're paying higher prices at the gas pump and potentially higher prices for food and other things that are sort of the snowball effects of higher gas prices. We're paying for it in our tax dollars. And we found that even though we did this tax receipt for last year, we did look and see how much it would be that the average taxpayer was paying for the war on Iran. And we found that the average taxpayer would be paying $130 just for so far for the war on Iran. And of course, if it goes much longer, that could grow much higher. And then the third way is that we'll be paying for the debt that this war budget is accumulating, because it is not all paid for by our tax dollars. And so that means for years to come, we and our children and potentially our children's children will be paying the cost of this.
But my understanding is, Lindsay, that the $1.5 trillion that Trump's asking for on top of the $1 trillion budget now, there's also an additional $200 billion for this war, isn't there? So isn't the figure $1.7 trillion?
It could be as high as that, yes. They've said they want $1.5 trillion for the war budget for next year. And now reports have been anywhere between sort of $80 billion to $200 billion for an additional amount for the war on Iran. So yes, we're potentially talking about as much as $1.7 trillion.
And the middle class and working Americans just paid their taxes. The deadline was yesterday. They pay the bulk of the taxes. The wealthy don't have to pay their taxes. There's certainly nothing proportional like going back to Eisenhower, where it was 92% that the rich paid. They've whittled it down to almost nothing nowadays, and some of the biggest billionaires don't pay anything. And by the way, some of these billionaires, like Musk and Thiel and company from Silicon Valley, they're getting in on the new military-industrial complex, which is called the digital industrial complex, where they're selling all kinds of robotics and digital all that techno-utopian nonsense coming out of Silicon Valley. So isn't that the cruel truth, that the guys that are making out like bandits from the federal government, in their noses in the trough, where the military-industrial complex has been sucking up the cream of the budget for decades, now the Silicon Valley guys have got their snouts in the trough too, and they don't pay taxes, and they're the richest people on the planet.
It's true on a couple of fronts that both the wealthiest people pay for typically a lower percentage of their income in taxes than people who are working class, ordinary working people do. They have all kinds of tax loopholes that they take advantage of, and in some cases, like you said, end up paying nothing. But in many cases, it's just they're paying a much lower rate than people who are working for a living. There's also corporate taxes, and there are many profitable major corporations that pay zero taxes, despite making goods that are hard for us to afford, having jobs where people can't earn a living wage. So they're creating all of these problems for working people and not paying taxes into the system to do anything to make life more livable for people. But in terms of the Pentagon contractors themselves, you're absolutely right. There is a new class of Silicon Valley contractors that are making out with Pentagon money. But the old contractors are still very much in play too. And we actually looked at that as well and found that the average taxpayer last year paid over $1,800 just for Pentagon contractors. And that's more than twice as much as the tax bill for pay for troops. And a lot of troops' families have to rely on food stamps to feed themselves and their families. So the fact that we're throwing this money at these contractors, and the top 5 Pentagon contractors had average CEO salaries of over $24 million, those are tax subsidized salaries. And then they're turning around probably and not paying a high tax rate on those salaries. So it's just a vicious cycle. And as long as we keep throwing more money at these contractors, and year after year, it's about half of the Pentagon budget that goes to contractors, we're just going to be perpetuating this same economic cycle where the rich get richer and the rest of us continue to struggle to get by.
So in the last minute, are the Congress balking, at least the Democrats? Because it's always been bipartisan. The Republicans and Democrats just throw money at the Pentagon blindly. But my sense is that they're balking at these kind of 1.5, 1.7 trillion. And do you think there's going to be a guns and butter debate nationwide? Because people don't like this war, yet they're paying for it.
That's right. I think we are very much already having a guns and butter debate. The amount of media coverage and ordinary people, and if you look at social media, the amount of posts and discussion about what we're paying for, especially this war on Iran, but what we're paying for war or what we're paying for mass deportations or any of these things versus what we could be doing on healthcare or nutrition or keeping people employed or any number of other things, education, whatever you want to think about. I think we're very much already having this debate. I do think that Democrats are balking at the $1.5 plus trillion for war. But what we need to make sure is that we don't actually continue to allocate any additional money for war. $1 trillion is already more than enough. And so Democrats are balking at 1.5 trillion. They should balk at 1.1 trillion. They should balk at any number that increases the war budget whatsoever, because if the Pentagon can't live within $1 trillion budget, then something is deeply, deeply wrong, and something is.
Well, Lindsay Koshgarian, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Lindsay Koshgarian, who's the Program Director of the National Priorities Project, where she oversees nationalpriorities.org. Her work on the federal budget includes analysis of the federal budget process and politics, military spending, and specifically how federal budget choices for different spending priorities and taxation interact. And she has an article at Common Dreams. The average taxpayer shelled out over $4,000 for war and weapons last year. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with Amy Goodman, the award-winning investigative journalist, author and host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, about the new film about her, Steal This Story, Please.
U.S. forces give the nod. It's a setback for your country. Bombs and trenches all in rows. Bombs and threats still ask for more.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Amy Goodman, an award-winning investigative journalist, author and host, and executive producer of Democracy Now!, which airs on more than 1,500 public television and radio stations worldwide. She's the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, including Democracy Now!, 20 years covering the movements changing America, and The Silent Majority, Stories of Uprising, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. And she's the subject of the new documentary from Carl Deal and Tia Lesson, Steal This Story, Please, which debuts tomorrow exclusively at the Laemmle Royal Cinema in West Los Angeles, with a national rollout to follow. Welcome to Background Briefing, Amy Goodman.
Oh, it's a great honor to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Amy. And you're in the business of speaking truth to power in a media landscape that's dominated by billionaire media barons who use power to shape their truth. And I think the glaring example is the Ellisons and Barry Weiss, which they are in the process of killing off CBS News. So it seems to me that independent media will actually have a more and more stronger future, because I suspect that you don't need another Fox News, which CBS will become. So don't you think people will migrate to more independent outlets like Democracy Now!
I think there is no more important time than now. No more important time than now to talk about independent media. The hunger is only growing. And I have to say, Ian, it's not only growing among those of us who've been in the independent media for a long time. I mean, I've been sounding these warnings for well over 30 years. And now it's journalists within the corporate networks that are saying, you can't say this loud enough. They are being gutted, sliced, and diced. I mean, you raised the issue of the Ellisons. David Ellison is the son of Larry Ellison. They've got Paramount Skydance, right? That merger was approved by Trump's FCC. And one of the things that happened right before is CBS decided to settle a lawsuit brought by Donald Trump for 60 minutes editing a Kamala Harris interview. Now, you know well, and any journalist does, sometimes we do an interview with someone for an hour, but you got to edit it down to 10 minutes. Of course, CBS would have won in court, or I think they would have. But instead, they gave Trump $16 million. They settled. Why? Because they were making much more money. That was a small price to pay to curry favor to get Trump's FCC to approve the Skydance Paramount merger for at least $6 billion. And now, as we speak, the New York Times, Variety, others are reporting on now that, David Ellison owns CBS, 60 Minutes, and they are trying, Paramount, to acquire HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers Discovery. David Ellison is having a dinner for President Trump to honor him. This is horrifying. Number of CBS reporters. I mean, is this the end of the legacy media as we know it? Let's look at the Washington Post. We just had a reporter from the Washington Post who did an analysis of the bombing of the girls' school, the primary school in southern Iran, in Manab, that killed 175 at least, overwhelmingly primary school girls. And it does clearly look like it was a U.S. Tomahawk missile, despite President Trump first blaming it on Iran. The reporter with the Washington Post, when she was in our studio, was no longer with the Washington Post because she had been laid off along with hundreds of others, with Jeff Bezos, who is standing behind President Trump, right, the founder of Amazon, the billionaire tech bro, at his inauguration. And he owns the Washington Post, and they've just laid off hundreds of reporters, gutting the newsroom. I think almost the entire Middle East division was laid off. And this is as we move into the U.S.-Israel attack on Iran. It is more important than ever. And so the power of this documentary done by the Oscar-nominated filmmakers Tia Lesson and Carl Deal it couldn't be more timely.
Well, we don't have a BBC here in this country to sort of set a journalistic standard. And we've always had media barons, but we've never had anything quite as flagrant as this current crop. And by the way, Larry Ellison promised Trump that when he takes over CNN, he'll fire all the anchors that Trump doesn't like. But in general, the brand that people levied against independent media is, not Trump now talks about leftist lunatics, but in general, this canard of the liberal media, I've never understood why anybody takes that seriously, because to be a journalist, you have to be liberal in the sense that you're open-minded, skeptical, don't believe the first thing that people say, and, are generally searching for answers. That, to me, is the very nature of being liberal. You're perfectly capable of being fair and balanced as long as you can basically make it clear where you're coming from, which I think is a more honest, because I don't think anybody on the right ever will accept they just keep moving the goalposts to the right. That's their tactic. And for some reason or other, the left falls for that.
I think our job is to be fair and to be accurate. That is absolutely critical. But with Democracy Now! For the last 30 years, the emphasis has been to go to where the silence is. As my colleague, co-host Nermeen Sheikh says, and steal the story, please, in the documentary, our job is to expand the frame. That's what we see our mission as, and to bring in the voices that have traditionally been outside the frame. And not only just to bring them in, but to center those voices. And I really do think, Ian, that those who care about war and peace, who care about the climate catastrophe, who care about that great sucking sound of the economy from the bottom to the top, who care about LGBTQ issues, racial and economic justice, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. It's what you do with Background Briefing. It's what we attempt to do with Democracy Now! It's why I think people are flocking to this documentary.
Well, Amy Goodman, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, thanks so much, Ian, and thanks for all you do.
And again, I've been speaking with Amy Goodman, who's an award-winning investigative journalist, author and host, and executive producer of Democracy Now!, which airs on more than 1,500 public television and radio stations worldwide. She's the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, including Democracy Now!, 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, and The Silenced Majority, Stories of Uprising, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope. And she's the subject of the new documentary from Carl Deal and Tia Lesson, Steal This Story, Please, which debuts tomorrow exclusively at the Laemmle Royal Cinema in West Los Angeles, with a national rollout to follow. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon and Asher Price. And if you've missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can visit us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for the daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. And you can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media managers, Evan and Luke Susswood, are also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.